So invite the Talmud in ways that the Jewish people never. So asking questions is the way in which you invite the Torah to speak to you. The question is what questions you ask, and now we have new questions that we're asking. And there's a tremendous amount of material. Really, there's a tremendous amount of material in past Jewish sources about basic questions of environment and sustainability. I spent a few years with a group of young people, some of them social activists and environmental activists in the country, studying a tract they call Ta'anit, which is about rain, trying to understand the relationship between what the Talmud says about the use of water and contemporary needs of the state of Israel. I actually gave a talk to 36 ambassadors from foreign countries in the foreign ministry, and I talked about the concept of water in the Bible, and at the end, the ambassador of South Sudan raised his hand and said, "We are struggling. We almost have a civil war in the south of Sudan because we don't have a fundamental ethic that allows us to understand how to deal with natural resources. Natural resources are always given to the people who have the greatest power. And now I understand that the Bible and the Talmud have something to say about power and water." I want to talk about a couple of very basic the language of symbolism in the Bible. It's almost a mythic language. The Bible uses the images of bread, something we're not going to talk about, to talk about power, to talk about national power. The relationship between Chametz and Matzah and Pesach, okay, has to do with the fact that Egypt was known as creating empire because they had the ability of using wheat to create bread. And the fact that the exodus from Egypt is connected to not eating bread that human beings create and eating bread that human beings don't create has to do with issues of power and sovereignty, not only with fundamental issues of slavery, etc., but has to do with very issues of sovereignty. When Joshua and the Jewish people reached the land of Israel, the first day of Pesach in the land of Israel, they're told, okay, now you're going to stop eating the man from the heaven, you're going to start eating the bread from the land, because only if you understand how to deal with the bread of the land are you going to be able to deal with the question of how you can be a sovereign people, knowing how to use power in a way that doesn't manipulate and exploit the land and people and its use of creating bread. But I'm not going to talk about bread today. I would like to take you on a short journey into the first two chapters of Genesis, first two chapters of the Torah, and to talk about the image of the rivers, the culture of the rivers, and the culture that was created without the rivers. We all know, we learned this in 9th grade in world history, back there in Chicago, that the great empires of the Middle East all grew up out of the rivers, out of the water. The Nile, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it was the water, it was the rivers that gave these cultures military power, economic power. That's why in 9th grade, when we began studying art and culture, it was taken for granted that it was the Babylonians and the Egyptians who created culture because they were the first civilizations, but they were civilizations because they had rivers. And yet there's another culture that was created in this book. When Abraham was told, leave Tigris and Euphrates and go to a small country where there's hardly any water and hardly any rivers. And your struggle, your national, political, and spiritual and cultural struggle will be with a civilization called Egypt that is born out of the Nile. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that Moses, right? It's a symbolic act. Moses, in a sense, was born in the Nile. He was placed in the Nile for 3 months. That's a symbolic language. Who controls the Nile? Who controls life? Whoever controls the Nile controls Paro. Paro was the great crocodile of the Nile. The Nile was a god. The crocodile was a god. Paro was a god. Moshe says life doesn't come from the Nile. And that's why the first plague is turning the Nile into death, because the whole symbol of the Nile is life. And the struggle between the Jewish people and the Egyptians is about life. I'll say one more thing before we begin Genesis. One of the important things that I need to say is that for many generations, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden took second place to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Life was an instrument to succeed in the tree of good and knowledge of good and evil. Life was the goal of life, was to succeed in understanding good and tov v'ra. And in fact, in the original story of Gan Eden, that's not the way it works. It works the other way around. The other way, the story of the Garden of Eden says, the purpose of the Garden of Eden is to eat from the tree of life. You're supposed to be able to eat from all the trees of the garden, and one of the trees of the garden you can eat from is the tree of life. That's why God created human beings, to eat from life, to have the benefits, to have the blessing of life. The instrument, the means to succeed in receiving the blessings of life that God wants to give us is to have an understanding of the limits of human creativity, the limits of human choice and freedom. But the goal is not the tree of good and evil. The goal is the tree of life. And the purpose of the Torah is not the end. The Torah is an instrument, is the means to create life. That's a new concept, returning the Jewish people to this place, this new reality. It's a new framework of understanding what it is we're talking about altogether. So I'm going to begin. Okay. Okay, we've got it. Let me just look at it for now. See what it is. Okay, on the other page. Okay, we're on the okay, we're on the 6th day. So me where that is. 6th day of creation.
Verse 24.
Verse 24, actually, we begin with the verse 26. Do you want to read it in English? And the next. And the next. And the next two. Okay. Professor Lynn White, I think it's from UCLA, a few decades ago, wrote a very important piece in which he said that this pasuk, that human beings were given the privilege of dominion over the world, was the source of the environmental crisis. And then there were those who responded in various ways. What you have to pay attention to, there's a basic paradox here. The paradox is that on the one hand, God says to human beings, you have dominion over all the creatures and over all the earth. And immediately then God says, but you're not allowed to eat any animals. You're not allowed to eat flesh. You can only eat grains and fruit from the trees. That's sort of a paradox. So wait a minute. If we can't take life of living creatures for our own sustenance, for our own well-being, what does it mean that we have dominion over them? How can we possibly have dominion over them? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Okay, well, Judaism is not Buddhism. And to a certain extent, and excuse me for saying this, Judaism is also not Christianity. And I may, if we had time, we would talk about this. and I would invite you all to discuss this. What I mean by that is that there's a very, very fundamental perception in this paradox that says human beings have the responsibility, have a special responsibility vis-a-vis the earth. Human beings have the gift of creativity, have the gift of initiative, have the responsibility to be involved in the world and to do something with the world that God created. And that's why God is creating a creature in the image of God. And the image of God, in the simple meaning of the text, simply means, and just like God creates, has creative abilities, God has the ability to control life in some way. Human beings have the same gift and are being asked to use that gift, not to separate themselves from their ability to control. One of the commentaries in trying to understand the sentence says, what does it mean that human beings have the ability the privilege to control animals? Well, when human beings have the privilege to create human habitation. And when you create human habitation, what happens to the animals? Right? Once upon a time here in Jerusalem, where I live, when we got there were cohorts of deer and antelope and fox. And now I can't see them anymore because there are a lot of houses around them. That's our responsibility is not to stay in small enclaves and leave the world to the lions and the tigers. We have a responsibility to do something with the world. And then on the other hand, what this sentence says is, you have to have limits. You have to understand the boundaries. You are not allowed to take life wantonly, and you're not allowed to put on the what do you call the madafim, the madaf, on the shelves of the supermarket. You're not allowed to put 25 different kinds of meat. Even if you eat meat and you're not a vegetarian, you're supposed to understand that taking life is something that is not done just because you want to have a rare steak and you want to eat different kinds of steak and different kinds of meat 3 times a week. You're allowed to eat meat for protein, says the Talmud. And you're allowed to eat meat on the holy days in order to celebrate. But the meat industry, the kosher, kosher, what Orthodox Jews only eat kosher. The kosher meat industry is not what the Talmud intended, the way it is today. And so there is this 2 sides to the human condition that the Torah talks about. Okay. But what I would like to, usually
So where do you draw the line?
Sorry?
Where do you draw the line?
As I was about to say, usually at this point I would stop and say, what do you want to say about this? Let's talk about it for a little while. But since I only have 1 o'clock, I'm going to have questions at the end, and I would like to say a few things. I'd be happy to come back again and talk some. The point that I want to make is this, for this discussion. In Genesis chapter 1, as we saw, human beings are created in the image of God. They're given a certain kind of dignity, I would say, of existential dignity. Created in the image of God. Wow. They're different than everybody else. And you asked, the question that I like to ask about Genesis chapter 1, there's something happening here, about Genesis chapter 1 is this question: what kind of relationships exist in the created world? In Genesis chapter 1. What kind of ksharim, what kind of chiburim, what kind of connections, what kind of relationships exist in Genesis chapter 1 between the creatures that God created? I'm going to stop and ask you, what do you think? What kind of relationships are described in Genesis chapter 1 between creatures? What kind of relationship exists between male and female in Genesis chapter 1?
No.
You're thinking about Genesis chapter 1, but there's male and female in chapter 1.
No, but not for chapter 2.
Well, there are no relationships between male and female in chapter 1.
Yeah.
They only appear in chapter 2. It's interesting that the center story of chapter 2 is the relationships between male and female. Mm-hmm. And in chapter 1, there are no relationships between male and female. Mm-hmm. What else? So what kind of relationships are there in chapter 1?
Well, if they're not eating each other,
Yes.
because people want to eat. Most people, that's why animals want to eat animals.
That's right.
So apparently they were having a harmonious relationship.
They were having a harmonious relationship in terms of their food. That's true.
They weren't killing each
They
other.
weren't killing each other. That's always a good thing. This world doesn't always seem to be the place where that people live up to that, but that seems to be the ideal. What kind of relationships are described in clear terms? Not something that we have to sort of derive. Okay, fair. Each one has its own kind. There are the Genesis chapter 1 is a picture of the world as almost a scientist would describe it. There are these kinds and those kinds and these kinds and those kinds, right? That's very important.
Meaning there was no hybrid.
All right?
There was no hybrid.
No hybrids. Exactly. There's a blessing, something very, very, when the Torah says it's good, the Torah means, yes, this every kind has its own very special quality, has its own very special characteristic. And that's what makes the world good. There is no evil in chapter 1. It's tov, good, vis-a-vis, non-existence. That which gives something its quality of existence is good in the eyes of God, because God wants life. And there is no evil.
Wait,
But what kind?
It does talk about gender though, doesn't it? Because in verse 27, it says male and female.
Yes. It doesn't say
And then it says in the next one to be fertile. So obviously there's some kind of relationship.
Okay, be fertile, I agree. They should have children. I'm talking about relationships. Okay. There are many, that's another area that I have some connection with. There are many families, unfortunately, there are many couples, unfortunately, who think that the only thing that they're doing is having children, which is a very important thing. No, certainly not going to knock that, but some couples think that's what it's all about. That's not what it's all about.
But from the Torah, isn't that? I mean,
In chapter 1. In chapter 1.
You would think.
I'd agree. In chapter 1, not in chapter 2. In chapter 2 is Vayula Basar Echad, they should become one flesh. V'davak be'ishto, he should cling to his wife. That's something else altogether. Okay, that's another topic. Let me say what I came to say. Chapter 1, relationships between the species are relationships of dominion and power. The sun and the moon and the stars have memshalah, they have dominion over the world. Apparently it's astrology. Man or human beings have, right, they control. There are no other relationships between the species in chapter 1. Each species is good in and of itself. What kind of interconnectedness is there? Nothing. Each day creates a different dimension of existence. There's no connection between the days almost.
But doesn't that lead to trouble?
That leads to a lot of trouble.
Your origin of tribalism,
Absolutely.
My species is good and your species is bad.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what I would like to say. That being created in the image of God, as it's described in chapter 1, has a lot of very, very important things to say about the nature of humanity, but it doesn't deal with the basic problem that we want to talk about today. It sort of creates the problem. Although, as Rabbi Yonatan says, the last psukim talking about food begins to give me an indication that there's something else that the Torah wants to say about the relationship between all these creatures. We would have, if we had time, we would talk about Shabbat, which is very important at this point. What does it mean that Shabbat is blessed? What does it mean that a day is blessed? It's very much connected to the blessing, which up until this point is fertility. Blessing is the creation of new life. Well, in what way does Shabbat create new life? We don't have time to talk about it. What I would like to say, though, we'll talk about is the beginning of chapter 2, after Shabbat, which is chapter 2 from verse 4. Jonathan, you want to read it?
Sure.
Such is the story of and
Okay, this is a completely different story about relationships, and it's really very, very similar to very basic environmental perceptions. It says as follows: for there to be fruitfulness in the world, for there to be growth in the world, for there to be blessing in the world, there needs to be interconnectedness. There needs to be, right, there is God created in this story, unlike Genesis chapter 1, God created vegetation and created the potential that vegetation would grow and reproduce itself. But there were two things that were missing in the world for this to happen. One was water, rain, and one was a creature whose, how shall I say, whose goal or his function in the world, whose tafkid, his role in the creation was to fulfill the blessing which was only in the aspect of being potential. The world only had a potentiality of being fertile and growing. And there was need for two creatures or two things in the world that God created. One would be rain or water, and one would be a human being. And both a human being and water, interestingly enough, right, have the power of creating life. Not just their own life and their own children, but life in the world. Human beings now are a reflection of the power of water to generate new life. That's what human beings are for in the world. But more than that, the story says, at this point, that every species have a blessing that is needed by some other species in order for the other species to grow. There are no species in the world that can be fruitful and multiply unless they receive a blessing from some other species in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this fundamental law of interconnectedness is what generates life. There is no possibility for life in the world without every species understanding that they have a very unique blessing from Genesis chapter 1 that no other species has. And that the purpose of having this blessing is to give some of it to some other species so that the other species can grow.
Can you give an example? On certain weeds, how does a tree get other species?
I once taught in a program where there was a young woman who was an environmental activist, Hagit Maimon from Ramat Raziel, and she once took me out into a small, not very giant forests in Israel, but she took me out to a small glade, and she said to me, "Look around. What do you see?" I said, "Look, I see some trees and some shrubs and some." I said, "You don't understand what you're seeing. What you're looking at is an ecological system. Right? There's nothing here that can grow without something else. There's photosynthesis. What's photosynthesis all about? Sun, vegetation, human beings. It's all system, basic system that reflects this basic principle. And as it's described here, it's very simple. Human beings want to eat. You want to eat? You want to eat your Cheerios? You want to eat Cheerios anymore. You want to eat, whole grains in the morning? Where are you going to get it from? Okay, well, you need the earth, you need the seed, you need water, and you need human beings who can develop all this. So human beings, like the picture of the water here is perfect. There are two understandings of what happened here. Either it's a spring or it's actually evaporation. We know today. What is rain? Rain is the oceans, the evaporation from the oceans, going up and coalescing on dust particles in the air, creating clouds. The wind moves the clouds from the Mediterranean, where the moisture is, over there. When there's when it happens to the land of Israel, the rain falls, the earth creates life, right? Human beings go out into the earth. It's all a process of who gives what to who. There's a wonderful blessing in Judaism that says, God created many creatures and all their misgivings and all their failures, or all their chasirim, all their deficiencies. And you say, why should I bless the deficiencies in the world? Well, one of the important things about relationships between men and women in marriage is to understand that everybody has a deficiency. And it's sometimes the deficiencies that are met by the wonderful possibility of growth together. The chapter 2 of Genesis is about a man and a woman because the story is about interconnectedness as the source of growth. And the ultimate story of interconnectedness as the source of growth, as far as this book is concerned, is man and a woman. But the original place where it happens in the story is out there, and is the vegetation and the ground, and the human beings who themselves were created from the ground. They were created from the ground, and they go back and replenish the ground, and then the ground gives them food, and then from the food they go back. It's all that's the story. That's the story of fertility and growth in the world. One more thing before I stop. There's a lot that so much to be said here. I'm really. What's very important to understand, okay, is this. The story of the Garden of Eden, which is now going to be about how human beings create life through interconnectedness and the give and take of the blessings of life to each other as human beings, as a social concept, as an environmental concept, etc. Doesn't really work in the Garden of Eden, even though in certain religious sources the Garden of Eden is sort of the ideal, but it doesn't really work, as we all know. One of the interesting things is the Garden of Eden is full of water. There's 4 rivers, wherever it is. However we understand where it is and how it's connected to the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Blue and the White Nile at the same time, which are the 4 rivers, but however we understand that, it's full of water. And the interesting thing is that later on in Genesis, when Abraham and Lot, his nephew, get into trouble about who controls the water hole, always who controls the water hole, which is the big problem in those days. Today it's who controls the gas fields. That's what's taking the place of the water, but it's the same story. Absolutely the same story. What do you do with the water? Today it's what do you do? Today that we don't really use water holes, and we don't even use the Canary anymore because we desalinate the Mediterranean. We have enough water for everybody. But today the question is, well, how do you deal with energy? That's the question today. Okay, leave that aside. Anyway, Torah says, okay, they have a big problem, and Abraham and Lot say to each other, let's split. And Abraham was a very, very, a lot of chesed. He wants to help his nephew. He says, you choose what part of Israel you want to live in. Basically, he says, you want to live in the north, which is a lot of water, I'll live in the south. That's what he said. That's what he says. And if you choose the south, okay, I'll live in the north. And Lot, of course, chooses not the north and not the south, but Sodom, the east. Because the storm in those days was like Switzerland. That's what the Torah says. Okay, but listen, the Torah then says a sentence that's very important that you need to pay a lot of attention to. The Torah says, and the area of Sodom was like the garden of God and like Egypt. So the Torah says, like the garden of God and like Egypt. And we know that Sodom and Egypt are the paradigms, the models of the alternative culture. not the culture that's created in this book, or that this book wants to see. It's the other guys who we have to struggle with and overcome, not just politically, but spiritually and ethically. They represent the destruction of the human spirit, Sodom and Egypt. And the Torah wants to tell me a very, very important thing about interconnectedness and life. And that is, when natural resources are easily accessible, it creates a spiritual and moral challenge for civilization that most civilizations are not capable of dealing with. That easy to come by natural resources often create dictatorship, totalitarian regimes, empires that have no respect for human life and no respect for life at all. In fact, after in talking about this, somebody once told me that Thomas Friedman wrote this book called The Small Earth, or The Small... The Earth is Flat, and one of the basic themes of the book is that he claims that wherever there was a tremendous amount of oil in modernity, we're not talking about global economy, where there was a tremendous amount of oil, there was a totalitarian regime. And he says, one of the interesting things about Israel is that it has very little natural resources. At least it didn't until recently. And as a result, it had to develop human resources. And it had to create a regime that allowed human beings to fulfill the gift of creativity that they had in order to succeed, in order to have a blessing of God. That's very fascinating. Something that we never paid attention to because we never lived in this country and we never asked ourselves questions about power and environment. So we never paid attention to the fact that the Torah wants us to appreciate the source of culture, the source of civilization, in terms of the natural environment in which it develops, as creating questions that deal with fundamental issues of ethics and morality. Abraham is chosen by God, and this the Torah almost immediately says, because he taught his children and his household the fundamental principles of the Tzedakah Mishpat, of life-giving virtues, of interconnectedness and justice. That's why he was chosen. And the first thing that he does is that he talks to God about saving the lives of the people in Sodom. That's the kind of civilization and culture that the Torah apparently invited us to think about in bringing the Jewish people to a land where the biggest river is the Yarkon. I remember in the United States, there was this very famous black slave spiritual was that blacks used to sing, the Jordan River is deep and wide, can't get to the other side. And I remember when I came to Israel first time, and I went on a trip and took me down to the Jordan. And they said, okay, here. I said, where's the Jordan? Okay, I see this, but where's the Jordan? And you almost jumped to the other side. There's places along the Jordan River. And so, sort of just an introduction to the introduction. I need to stop. It's an introduction to, there's a tremendous amount of material. The symbolism of water, the symbolism of rain, the symbolism of bread, the symbolism of the rivers. I need to say one more text and I'll stop. One of the prophets, Hosea, says that in the end of days, in the days of the Messiah, there will be no more dominion. Okay, no more rule of human beings over animals and over between animals. We'll return to the picture of Genesis chapter 1 in terms of the picture, the harmonious picture. But then, okay, Hosea says the following. He says, I don't want, it's like God is saying, God says, I don't want you to call me Ba'ali, I want you to call me Ishi. That was a play on the theological principle, the theological worship principles of the days of the pagans, of those days who called their gods Ba'alim, who called their gods Ba'alim. And Ba'alim is a Hebrew word that means person who has power over others, has ownership over others. It's used in a gender context. It was used in a theological context. And interestingly enough, it was used in an agricultural and environmental context to refer to land that human beings don't irrigate, that only God irrigates. Only God gives water to. And God says, listen, the fundamentals of faith that I want you to have is to appreciate that what I'm interested in is relationships and interconnectedness. I want you to talk to me. I want you to be like my wife, and I don't want to be a Baal to you. I don't want to own you. I want you to talk to me. That's what Al-Shia says. I want you to call me Ishi. And that a theological idea that even God asks to be called Ishi is such a basic idea in culture that says dialogue, interconnectedness, giving and taking, listening, giving, responding, giving life, receiving life. That's what it's all about. It's not that we don't have power. We have power. It's easy to be powerless and live like that. It's difficult to be one of the leading high-tech nations in the world, to have one of the most powerful economies in the world, and at the same time to understand that what creates life and growth is interconnectedness, dialogue, giving life to others, receiving life, as the Torah describes it. That's what the Torah is interested in. Okay, let me stop here. I have about 10 minutes. I'll ask us anything.
Interesting.
What is your name?
Bishop Monza, Bishop Scott.
I'm sorry to get your last name. Your first name.
My first name is Scott.
Scott, okay. Ken, what would you like to say? What would you like to say about all this?
No, it's quite interesting and with one, giving a lot of insights on the understanding of the Bible. I've learned a lot, and would have loved, if given time, to learn more.
I would have loved, if given time, for us to be able to talk about all this together. Ken, what else? Thank you.
Almost the opposite of the connectedness is being alone, and probably one of the worst things for the human being psychologically is to be alone. So widowers die more quickly after losing. In other words, that connectedness seems to me is important. It might be the psychology of life. Or as I say, life is a series of attachments and separations.
Yes.
The attachments are wonderful, and the separations
are negative.
They happen, though.
Yeah.
I would like just to mention that, as I mentioned, in Genesis chapter 1, everything is good. Almost everything is good, and the whole thing is very good. And there's no bad. The opposite of tov is non-existence. Genesis chapter 2, we know that there's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But there is the first time in the Tanakh that the Tanakh says lo tov. There's something that's not good. And lo tov is to be alone. Lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good. And when the Torah says good, it doesn't just mean it's, you have, what do you call it, your issues. It means in God's eyes, as far as life is concerned, being alone is not good in terms of the hard disk of life. And that's why God says, well, now I have to create man and woman in order to deal with it. Of course, that doesn't always help, that doesn't always solve the problem, but it has the potential of solving the problem.
Yes.
And that it's low, that's the low tov. Low tov liot adam levado, just as you said. Ken. Jonathan, Ken.
Yes. Okay. But at our times, most people live in cities.
Right.
We're inside buildings most of the time. On concrete, by the parking lots, building. In the time we're living in, how do we have that relationship with Earth?
Well, first I want to say that that's your problem. I mean, I teach Torah. I don't have to deal with reality. And there are people like you that they don't have to deal with real problems. Then what I do want to say, and actually when we had our Beit Midrash that studied these issues, and we asked that question, very important. In Australia today, as far as I remember, every house saves its water, saves rainwater. It has a whole, you can't build a house, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it's a law there or something. There's many homes in Australia that have to have, what do you call it? Sorry?
Collection system.
Collection system, and the water is taken to a agam, like a natural reservoir. And certainly that's very critical in areas where there are water scarcity. What's very interesting is that one of the important tools of Israel's foreign policy today is the gift of water to areas of water scarcity. Because in Israel, where there's a tremendous gift of startup, many of us in our gardens in Israel have these taftafot, these drip irrigation. The Israelis created drip irrigation and are selling it to African countries and other countries as part of their foreign policy. Okay, so there's water, but there's also, of course, as we all know, what is it? Recycling, which is critical.
Which is not so good yet.
Sorry?
Which is not so advanced yet.
Not so advanced. But it's something that at least in the last few years, there is a growing, let's call it a growing awareness. You don't think so? Okay. There are at least they put them on the streets. I don't know if people use them.
But as far as I understand, they are not. Like, even if you separate it, the city at the moment doesn't.
It doesn't separate. Okay. Well, what I want to say is that there has to be a consciousness of the interconnectedness between human consumption and the world around us. That's relevant to people who live in cities. You can't ask a person who lives in a city to appreciate an olive tree, a beautiful olive tree that can live 1,000 years, because you never saw an olive tree. Although if you live out where I live, you can see olive trees, and you can appreciate the beauty of olive trees and what an olive is. Okay, and how it gives light. But you have to do it in a way in which people in the cities can do that. But you have to create the consciousness. I think that Mihzor is certainly one of the ways to do that. It's very important. It's also, I think, very important to people to understand what it means to drink water that's from the Mediterranean. And one of the things that we wrote about I actually wrote a book on this, and I wanted to bring the book, and as usual, I always forget to bring the books that I want to show people. But in the book that we interviewed the people who are responsible for the Meshek HaMayim, the water authority in Israel, to ask some questions that came from our understanding of the Talmud. Okay, and it's not so simple, this desalination thing. In terms of security issues, and in terms of understanding and creating a consciousness that's Zionist to the importance of land and water, which is so basic to what it is to live in this country. And they talked about it. And so how do you in schools and in kindergartens, how do you educate young people to appreciate the fact that now you don't have to, as 20 years ago, you were not allowed to leave the tap dripping because they put you in jail maybe, but to appreciate water. That's a tremendously important symbolism of water, meaning of water gives life. You know, you can't take it for granted. That's very important. And the other things as well. Okay, Mamash, I need to go to the Jonathan. And come back and we'll talk some more.
Yes. Interesting.
So, Rabbi?